Hi YouTube, my name is Morgan and I'm a piano instructor at Freeway. And today I have a video for you about how to practice the piano. I give you my top 5 practice tips because I know that a lot of times, I know myself as a teacher, I'm guilty of telling my students that they need to practice more, or I ask them how much they practice. So we talk about how much the students practice, but we don't tell you guys how to practice sometimes. Sometimes that falls through the cracks. So here I am going to give you some tips so that if you've been wondering why you spent an hour at the piano and the song sounds the same as you did when you started an hour ago, I'm going to show you some ways to change up your practice and hopefully you'll be seeing some more results because I know they help me. I know I've seen it help my students as well. So here we go with the top 5 practice tips for piano. So just as an example throughout the lesson, I'm going to be using just a line over what we call a 2-5-1 progression. You don't need to know what the line is to understand how I'm changing it when I practice, but as an example, here's the normal line by itself. So that's the line. So my first tip for today, if I were trying to learn this, whether it was written or I had just heard it and I was trying to figure it out, my first step, or if I had already figured it out, my first step would be to slow it down. If I were struggling to play it, the best thing you can do, and one of the biggest mistakes we make as pianists and as any musician, is we want to go 1,000,000 miles a minute right away. And even though that's fun and that can be rewarding, the only way it works is if we do the work in the practice room slowly to where we can get to that level. So even though our temptation is to go as fast as we possibly can the first time, if we're learning a Beethoven sonata or we're learning a Miles Davis piece, what we want to do is we want to slow it down because that gives our brains a chance to comprehend what we're doing. We get to see it visually, and also orally, with our ears, our brains get a chance to comprehend what they're hearing as well, better when it's slower. So it helps our brains in 2 different ways, and it's also a little bit easier to do under most circumstances. So if you can restrain yourself, it's best to slow down sometimes when you practice. Like that. That's the same line. I played the exact same notes that I did the first time, but this time I slowed it way, way down so that I could concentrate on what I'm doing and so that my brain could have a chance to focus on it. So, tip number 1 is slow practice. Another one of the biggest mistakes we can make as musicians is every time we play, we try to play the entire piece or the entire song or an entire section of a song. We try to play it all through at the same time, and we keep doing that over and over and over. When we keep messing up at the same parts usually when we run it over and over. So that's another mistake that we make as musicians. And to counter that, practice tip number 2 is about isolating small sections. So what I mean by that is if I was having trouble with just the first 3 notes, or just the first 4 or 5 notes, just that much right there, and I kept messing it up. So what I can do is instead of messing it up and keep going, I can take just a few notes of that and work just that part. And you can slow that down too. Tips 1 and 2 can go together until I can perform that much by itself. And then I can take the next section of it and practice that by itself too. Then, once I've practiced all of the little parts individually, all together into the larger section. So practice tip number 2 is to take small sections of what you're doing. Practice tip number 3 can help us whether we're playing written music or we're playing based on what we've heard in a song, because practice tip number 3 is counting aloud. Whether we're looking at a page and we're seeing a whole lot of 16th notes or 32nd notes or some strange syncopations, or if we're listening to a song and there's some really fast tricky sections in there or some really strange rhythmic areas, counting aloud will give us a chance to orient ourselves into the rhythm. It'll help us figure out what it's doing, and it'll help us be able to get the rhythm correctly every time. Once you figure out where everything goes in the measure, counting aloud can be super helpful to orient yourself to get it right every time rather than just guessing when it comes along. I know almost every pianist is probably guilty of guessing on some rhythms at some point in their lives. So this will help us get out of that habit by practicing counting aloud. So if I were going to count aloud while I was playing this line, this is all 16th. We have 1E and a 2E and a 3E and a 4E and a 1E and a 2. And it ends on beat number 2. So now that I've figured that out, if I count it each time I play, I'll know that I'm not making any mistakes and that I'm practicing it correctly. So counting aloud, tip number 3, can be really helpful for us. Practice tip number 4, you may have seen me doing throughout the video, because practice tip number 4 is actually playing hands separately. So in the past, I've just worked on my right hand, because the right hand is the more complex part, because when I showed you the line at the beginning of the video, I just did a simple left hand accompaniment like that. But what if we had a more complex part like this? So if we were going to put those together, it might take a lot more work on both of the hands by themselves. So I might want to use my other practice strategies to help me with just one hand at a time. So just the left hand, I could practice counting aloud. 1E and a 2E and a 3E and a 4E and a 3E and a 2E and a. And then I could do the same with the right hand, as we did in the previous video. So using the practice strategies split up between the hands will help us put them together once we have our finished product. Alright, so we made it all the way to practice tip number 5. And practice tip number 5 actually has nothing to do with the piano at all, because you can do it with or without a piano as long as you have your two hands. So practice tip number 5 involves clapping. So in practice tips earlier, we dealt with rhythm a little bit too. But let's say putting the rhythm and the notes together is just getting to be too much for you. Let's say there's just a little bit too much syncopation. Let's say getting used to clapping or getting used to playing all the 16th notes like I have in my line is just a little bit too daunting for you, and you have to get into a good rhythm of it first. So counting aloud and clapping at the same time can be a really good tip. So we can do this even without the piano. Even if you don't have a piano nearby, you could practice counting through some of your music and clapping along with it. You could clap your part. So clapping is a really great practice strategy for us when we're really stumped on rhythms. So just as an example, in the previous section, the right hand was just all 16th notes, right? So if I were going to clap that part, it wouldn't be too interesting, but sometimes it could help me get into the groove of the line itself. So just 1E and a 2E and a 3E and a 4E and a 1E and a 2. Just clapping all the way through that. Or I could use it to clap the left hand part, because we remember that one was a little bit more complex rhythmically. So that one was 1E and a 2E and a 3E and a 4E and a 1E and a 2E and a. So clapping can give us a way to get away from the notes of the piano, because the notes can make everything complex. Sometimes my eyes just glaze over looking at all of the keys on the piano. So we can get away from the notes and we can just isolate the rhythm. And once we've figured out the rhythm, it can be easier to carry that back over to the piano. So practice tip number 5 is clapping. So now we've been through all 5 practice tips. What you'll find when you use this in your own practice is that you end up using the practice tips together. We saw that throughout the video when we would be using, like we'd slow down so that we could count aloud while we practice. 2 of our practice strategies working together right there. So work together. These strategies will work together, and you'll find that you'll get a lot more mileage out of your practice time if you use some of these tips rather than just trying to do the same thing over and over. So I hope this video helps you in your practice, and either way, thanks for watching, and keep playing and keep practicing.